From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Hello, thank you for joining us again. Our guest today is Observer columnist John Schindler. Welcome back, John.
Great to be here.
And on that note, we will move on to our first issue, which is Issue 1, Cold War 2.
After a brief respite, US-China tensions again increased this week after Canadian authorities arrested a Chinese business executive on a US warrant. Meng Wanzhou, chief financial officer of Chinese tech giant Huawei, is detained on charges believed to relate to sanctions busting with Iran or North Korea. But while Huawei is accused of US intellectual property theft and supporting Chinese espionage, Beijing reacted furiously to Meng's arrest. Oh, and the already unshaky markets were not so gratified. Traders feared Chinese economic retaliation.
Pat, is this hardline the right track?
Tom, the basic question we got to ask ourselves is, what is China? Is China a trade partner? Is it a friend? Is it an ally? Is it an adversary? Or is it a Cold War antagonist and enemy? In which case, the Americans are going to have to decouple our economy from the Chinese economy, and we got $500 billion in trade every year, and China gets a $400 billion trade surplus this year. I think we're really headed down the road to decide whether we're going to have a long-range Cold War with China, based on its behavior, and its behavior would seem to indicate that.
Would you support that, though?
I think we got to do what we got to do, but I don't believe we ought to really be we've had one Cold War and it's over, and I don't want another.
Eleanor.
Most Americans have probably never heard of this company. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Huawei.
Huawei.
Okay.
That's my YouTube told me that. So.
Okay, and they only have 1% of the market in this country, and they've been locked out because they are seen as an arm of the intelligence community in China and the government in China. But detaining this woman who's not just the CFO of this company, she's the daughter of the founder. The New York Times said it would be like detaining Sheryl Sandberg while in Beijing, while Sheryl Sandberg is the daughter of Bill Gates or somebody. You know, you can't get any higher in Chinese royalty. And this is something that President Xi simply cannot let stand. He has to respond, as well he should. And do we really want to get into a diplomatic war?
So you think it was wrong?
I think it's high stakes game. The president is thinking he's really squeezing President Xi, and so he will capitulate. And the president is doing it because Mr. Tariff Man is not working in the United States, and the markets have said, you know, up yours, this is not working. And so this is a typical kind of diversionary tactic by our president.
John.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is about more than Trump. This is a broader international wave that has been building for years. Trump is obviously pushing it on the U.S. side, but Australia, Canada, the EU are starting to push back just as we are, very seriously, on China's massive industrial and intellectual property theft, which is the underpinning of the Chinese economy. Let's make this very clear. China can't back down because this literally threatens their entire economic future. China has become what it is not just because of trade concessions and unfair trade advantages, which they have, but because they are stealing Western technology and intellectual property on a scale never seen in
So
human
you think
history.
it's the right decision?
It is absolutely the right decision, and we need more of it. Huawei is the face, the public face of Chinese intelligence. That is simply a fact. Western governments know this, and if they want to arrest Sheryl Sandberg, be my guest.
All right, Clarence.
Well, this is where the president's love of simplicity and his aversion to reading troubles me, because we're talking about a complicated situation here, one in which he's had a grudge against China for a long time, long before he declared his candidacy. He was tweeting about how China was robbing us, taking us to the cleaners, and worse. Well, fine, but policy and actual implementation are two different things. And this particular way, what may be seen internationally, like he's holding hostage the head of a major corporation in China, where the line between capitalism and politics is blurred, and government ownership, etc., is blurred anyway, making it even more complicated. There are ways to work this out diplomatically without this kind of high drama.
Look, is this technology theft? Is this shaking down our companies over there? Are the currency manipulations? Are all of these, do they come out of the character of the communist Chinese regime? And do they indicate where it is going and what it intends to do? That this is not simply, you know, they made a mistake, we slap them on the hand.
Well,
I think it tells us the character, if it tells us the character of the Chinese Communist regime, we got to develop an overall policy toward China which cannot include $500 billion in trade.
Well, this
well the business community and the government is intertwined in China. It's intertwined in this country as well. But to threaten this woman, Ms. Wang, with a 30-year sentence for evading sanctions that were actually lifted when Obama was in office because it was part of the Iran nuclear deal, it's way out of proportion. It's a bullying tactic. Now, maybe it will succeed, but I think the price of this, the price of succeeding, is too great a risk in terms of the diplomatic ties with China, which after all holds our debt.
Right.
You know, they're our banker. We can't afford for them to have a problem either.
Well, they can't afford it, but the real problem here is China has ways of lashing out at us that could be very dangerous in the South China Sea and elsewhere where tensions are already rising, where our freedom of navigation operations are already being contested.
Would you let them have that and more focus on the economic stuff?
I think in the long, well, we're not going to let them have it. It is about freedom of navigation, about global trade, but I think we can do things to minimize a potential conflict. We can make concessions elsewhere.
But you know, freedom of
Some
navigation.
Let's let Clarence
I was just going to say that the one thing about the nature of the Chinese regime is it's not communist per se or communist in name only. You could say it's really a system of state capitalism where you've got folks at the top who are organizing and operating a capitalist system, but at the same time, in some ways, almost extorting
But you know, Tom, let me ask you. I mean, they've got 6 or 7 militarized islands and reefs in the South China Sea. They're not interfering with commerce in there. A third of the world's commerce goes through there. But what are you going to do to get the Chinese off those islands? Are we going to do anything? Vietnam won't do anything. The Philippines won't do anything. Why is there a problem?
If this particular encounter has a happy ending, Ms. Wang will go home with honor to China, and America will sell more soybeans to China. That's the best outcome, and it may happen that way.
You're talking about the trade relationship in a narrow sense. I'm talking about the whole relationship with China in the future. I agree with you. She's going to go home.
Right.
Well, she going home?
Yeah, she will, of course, but not tomorrow.
All right, we will move on. Issue 2, Wisconsin rules.
Democrats and Republicans in the Wisconsin State Senate clashed this week over Republican efforts to weaken the powers granted to the governor and attorney general. If approved by outgoing GOP Governor Scott Walker, the changes would prevent incoming Democratic Governor Tony Evers from changing major programs without legislative assent. That matters because the incoming legislature will be controlled by the Republicans. The changes would also prevent Evers from following through on a pledge to withdraw Wisconsin from a multi-state lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. Democrats also fear the GOP changes will limit their ability to alter voter ID laws.
Eleanor, do Republicans have a good excuse here?
No, this is trying to institutionalize voter fraud, basically. And they're following the North Carolina playbook. They tried the same thing in North Carolina. It's still in the courts. And the thing is that the courts in Wisconsin, I don't know quite how they tilt, but you know, this is not going to be accomplished overnight. But it is so bald-faced. I mean, they don't like the results of the election, so they pass laws that will limit the powers of the incoming executives, claiming they're just doing it to balance out power. That's not how democracy works.
Should Governor Scott Walker...
It is how democracy works.
Should Governor Scott Walker sign it?
Yeah, look, this is politics.
Should he? Answer that.
Yes, look,
right.
They ought to play hardball. That's what they're playing, hardball. And they may get paid back in 2020 for what they're doing.
Absolutely.
They're doing things in Michigan.
They got the pitchforks out.
This is a real battle between the two parties, and they're taking every advantage they can. And you can applaud it or you can condemn it, but it's going to happen, Tom.
Yeah, but
I personally think Wisconsin gets these ideas from Illinois, but they have a tradition of this kind of hardball politics. Back when Walker took over, at one point, the Democratic legislature senators came down to Illinois so they wouldn't be forced to vote.
They fled.
Make a losing vote.
But what do you think of it?
So
do you think it's...
Well, your original question was, is this democracy or not? Legally, statutorily, yes, but politics means, well, democracy is supposed to be the will of the people, which they certainly expressed in the last midterm election there in Wisconsin. This is designed to reverse election results. Interestingly enough, their impeachment efforts, which failed against Walker, were designed to do the same thing, but from the other side, you know, in order to try to kick him out after being duly elected. So I think there will be some payback down the road. Wisconsin's that kind of state. The voters can get real militant both ways.
Well, overriding the will of the people is not democracy. And in North Carolina, I think we should also point out the ballot harvesting, a new term I had never heard of, having people, operatives go around collecting absentee ballots, destroying the ones they don't like, maybe filling them out. The Republicans are using every tool, but some of those tools are illegal.
Okay, John,
the optics of this are terrible, no matter whether it's legal or not, whether it's democracy or not. Right now, this is not the message the GOP needs to be sending coming off the midterms. And you're right, 2020, there could be some pain for this in 2020, and that should be the GOP's concern.
Okay, and John, and on another note that we should bring up for the panel here, we've had these new findings or court documents released from the special counsel. What is your read of Mr. Cohen and Mr. Manafort's relevance to Trump?
Highly relevant. This is terrible news for the president. There's no getting around.
Why?
No matter what he tweets, this is terrible news. For the first time, the Mueller inquiry and the Justice Department have put on paper indelibly that there was collusion with Russian state entities in 2016 between the Trump campaign and operatives of the Kremlin. This is simply a fact now, and no amount of angry tweets from the president or no amount of Sean Hannity distracting everyone can change that. The narrative's changed.
Well, look, this was not a good week for the president. There was not a good day on Friday, no doubt about it. But look, Trump as candidate can contribute as much money as he wants to his campaign, whether it's for Stormy Daniels or whatever. But I do think this, as I've always said here, this is eventually going to get down to the point where Mueller files his report and the Democratic House decides, what's his name, Nadler, or the rest
Jerry
of them,
Nadler,
whether they're going to take up the impeachment issue. A lot of people are going to force them to do it, and this is going to be the issue of the next 2 years.
On that campaign question, by the way, the documents indicate that because Cohen was out in a funding that involved other people besides the president himself or individual number one, that made it part of the campaign, that he was acting on behalf of the campaign, and therefore
he pled guilty to a felony.
There are more facts and evidence here for people who believe in facts and evidence that indicate that this president was engaged in highly illegal activities, crimes, in order to influence the election and to win the White House.
Is that right?
Exactly. Now, impeachment is a road that the House will probably go down, but in due time. Let's let Mueller report. Let's have hearings. Let's have it unfold so the American people can see clearly everything that's going on. This is a bunch of grifters who got into the White House. They didn't think they were going to win, and they were cashing in every step of the way, and they were colluding with an enemy government in order to subvert our election, to get in a position to earn more money.
John, so the Constitution, high crimes and misdemeanors, but a lot of Trump people would say, show me the meat here. It's been going on. He was democratically elected. Sure. It's unfair. Show me the meat. Where is the meat, mister?
Well, the meat's coming. The meat was in a lot of those blacked out pages of redactions in some of the Justice Department documents that came out this week.
But we've been hearing that.
Sure, because Mueller is very, very methodical. He's moving in concentric circles of indictments, and it's coming. You know, the steamroller's coming.
But there is no evidence of high crimes yet.
I don't think that's true at all.
Did this name individual number one as an unindicted co-conspirator?
An elected president is going to be removed because he paid off a woman to keep silent?
Pat,
that's the smallest part of this.
Clarence time.
No, I'm just saying that these documents essentially name or don't name him, but say he's the unindicted co-conspirator, really.
Right.
So there is meat.
You think so?
Here, and there's more to come.
Okay.
He's protected by the presidency because they won't indict him, but his family members aren't, and so how does he deal with that? And,
that's the crime. Pat, how do you think this will play out? I mean, you say it's going to go to the public forum, but when?
I think we're going through 2 years of unmitigated hell, quite frankly, where all these issues and all this garbage and trash is distracting the country. I'll tell you what it's making. It's making democracy look ridiculous in the whole world.
No.
Why? Why?
Because look at why do you think people are moving toward autocrats? They look over here at what Americans are doing for themselves, the greatest democracy on earth, every night on TV. That's all we got is Stormy Daniels and all this garbage. I'll tell you, this is why the U.S. is headed downhill in the global, in the sense of global esteem.
We're trying to stop an autocracy.
Stormy Daniels is a very, very minor player in all of this. And basically, this is about democracy. It's about congressional oversight, and it hasn't been done for 2 years. There are so many ethical lapses in this administration.
The world is impressed by this?
They're all cashing in on this presidency.
You think the world is impressed by this?
They'd be less impressed if we didn't do anything when we see an autocracy going on.
What changed this week, what fundamentally changed, it is perfectly clear from the documents we've seen that Mueller is ultimately going after the president himself, not just people around him, on collusion, to use a non-legal term.
Would you agree with that?
He uses the word
look,
synergy.
Look, ultimately, they're after the president, but I mean, what would you ask yourself? What do you think would we be talking about something more important than this? Or should we be, quite
Sounds
frankly?
like the Lewinsky
We
case.
have it on every week this nonsense.
Coach Bridge, that's coming up.
Well, see, okay, it's at least a serious issue, Ukraine and Russia.
We should be talking about climate change, Pat. I'm sure you'd be eager for that.
No,
that is more important,
Well,
actually.
on climate change, though,
It is more important.
we have seen the Paris revolt to climate change, have we not?
Well, we've seen the Paris revolt
Don't
to
take
raising
my
gas
prediction.
taxes. That was the wrong. That was the wrong step.
Yeah, President Macron, I think, is going to have to deal with that robustly. The Fifth Republic must have its order sustained, and otherwise we're going to see some little French revolutionaries running around.
You would have seen Mr. Macron gone if he didn't lift that tax.
Okay, all right. We will move on. When we come back, the INF Treaty and NATO showdowns. Also, stay with us during the break as we hear from some experts about how to improve our nation's schools. It's the focus of a new report called Promise to Practice from the Collaborative for Student Success. See you in a moment.
What do you believe is the most important consideration when we're talking about doing this or having this turnaround with our lowest performing schools?
So turnarounds are possible, and you can take giant systems and organizations and take them into the modern era and have success. However, we also have a number of schools and school districts who look more like Sears, where they're closing buildings and they don't have a great strategy and it's not clear what the future is going to bring. So how do we make sure that we're putting our bets, our resources, our talent into the system in the right way? DC, I think, is working on this and trying to do that. We've identified other states in the Promise to Practice report that are really trying to organize themselves around what's the right organizing principle. It's not the same for everyone. How do we make sure we have the right staff in the right places? We use data, we use research as much as we have, and we continue to check back in. We don't just set it and forget it. We actually come back and say, did that work?
Issue 3, INF.
NATO's 29 member states condemn Russia this week for what they say is Russia's breach of its obligations under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty. NATO says Russia has unjustly deployed a nuclear-armed missile system banned by the INF strike range. The US says it will withdraw from the INF Treaty if Russia does not resume compliance. It wasn't the only US-Russian tension this week. NATO forces also conducted an overflight of Ukraine. This follows Russia's firing on of 3 Ukrainian vessels in the contested Sea of Azov.
John, is the US right to threaten to withdraw from the INF Treaty?
Yeah, I don't think we really have any choice. The Russians are clearly in breach of the treaty. The treaty, of course, that was the crowning glory of the Reagan administration and how we got to end the Cold War peacefully in no small part. This is a very sad thing, but we are correct on this. The Russians are egging this on.
And what happens?
This plays well with the domestic audience.
What happens next with Ukraine and these broader tensions?
Nothing good. I mean, we have an unfortunate situation where I think eventually the Russians are going to give the Ukrainians back their sailors, but not the boats they took. So much for that. But look, let's be honest here. This works well for Putin. The economy is not doing well. Beating up on petulant Ukraine from the Russian perspective, showing them who's boss, is very popular with a lot of Russians, and especially they can keep it on low boil without all-out war, this will just continue. And by the way, there are people in Kiev who want the same thing.
Right.
Look, this INF treaty was a good treaty. You did away with these intermediate range nuclear missiles from 300 miles to 3,000 miles. But let me tell you, if we pull out of that treaty, the Europeans this time will not accept American intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe the way George Bush sold them for Ronald Reagan. And the Russians can continue to build there. The real problem here is the Chinese missiles, or virtually all of them intermediate range nuclear missiles, to hit American targets offshore, Japan, and the rest of it. I don't know how, if you get back into a nuclear arms race with intermediate range missiles, it makes the United States in a better position.
I agree with that. I mean, what is the benefit of pulling out? I mean, you stay in this treaty, okay, they're not complying with it. You try to work with them. You punish them in other ways. You don't take away the sort of the foundation that has existed, you know, since the quaint era when we concluded as two superpowers that intermediate range missiles pose a uniquely destabilizing threat, and they still do.
But I don't think you can decouple this from the broader activities of Putin on NATO's eastern frontier for the last several years of open aggression in places, not against NATO directly, but very aggressive acts against NATO aircraft and ships. This is part of one big whole. I don't want to get out of
there. There are many ways. There are many ways. We have a lot of leverage.
What are we supposed to do? Seriously, if this is Putin saying, what are you going to do now?
Well, you sort of described it earlier when you said, indicated that the brinksmanship is a way of life with Putin. And this is how he rallies support for himself and keeps the rest of the world on edge. But we don't really have a long-range plan here, and especially with this administration, where the president's relationship with the head of state there in Russia is rather unusual compared to the rest of our policy and the long range. I don't know if I really want him to make any long-range choices.
Well, Tom, if we start building intermediate-range nuclear missiles that can go, let's say, 2,500 miles, exactly where are we going to
deploy? We're not talking about that, are we? We're talking about
if you get out of the treaty, the Russians will go all out, and you're going to have to match them, and where are you going to put the missiles?
Don't match them, right? Just have the SSBN.
It's not clear to me that we're going to.
Well, don't match them, then the Russians are unleashed to do what they want, and the Chinese can do what they want.
If they launch nukes, you can nuke them back.
Maybe they'll drive themselves in the back.
I mean, this is a horrible thing to talk about, but deterrent.
That kind of glib talk is really, you know.
But deterrent posture.
You nuke us, we nuke you.
No, but there's a very important point here.
Diplomacy should be involved here. I'd love to hear from our ambassador to Russia. Where is John Huntsman?
Good question.
Photo ops, I assume. Look, there's a very important point here, which Russia, under Putin, has moved greatly towards normalizing the use of nuclear weapons at a tactical to intermediate level, which the Soviets did much the same thing. They've gone back to that kind of posture. NATO has not thought seriously about nuclear weapons now in a whole generation, thankfully, and now we have to again.
But maybe you should have thought of that before moving NATO into the Eastern Baltic and the Black Sea and all the Balkans and everywhere else. Well, we did. The reason you got problems in the Sea of Azov, which not 1 in 1,000 Americans could locate, is because you moved your alliance right on their front porch, and they reacted to it.
Well, talk about normalizing nuclear weapons. It's President Trump who asked, why do we have all these nuclear weapons if we don't use them?
Did they ever get the answer?
Right.
Pay attention to it.
But do you want to respond to that?
Look, I think NATO enlargement is, look, Ukraine's not in NATO. U.S. policy is that Ukraine and Georgia will be in NATO sometime between this afternoon and the end of geologic time.
Right.
Which is, in other words, never. So I'm sorry, Pat, but throwing that out there is not really what this is about at all.
Well, it is what are you doing over there in the Kerch?
We're not doing anything. We're not doing anything.
People are saying send the NATO fleet. What fleet is that into the Black Sea?
I'm not saying that.
Are you crazy?
What do you think in a policy sense we should do, though, with the Russians in terms of, so the idea of deterrence, right, is that the enemy must know your capability and your willingness to use in kind.
Right.
So,
and we are doing that, by the way. And let me make something very clear. For all of Trump's utter nuttiness towards Putin, this sort of strange boyfriend-boyfriend relationship we saw in Helsinki, that is not reflective at all of U.S. policy. And let me make this very clear. The State Department, the Pentagon, our intelligence community have taken a much tougher line on Russia under President Trump than they ever did under President Obama.
So
as strange as that sounds, that is the truth.
And to put in a good word for NATO, it's not like they're going into hostile territory. They're going where the people that live there want protection from the Russians.
They want our protection?
Yes.
Well, why should we go give it to them?
It's called
And
international
halfway around the world?
alliances. You
Suppose
have-
Kazakhstan wants to join NATO and have us protect them from China and Russia.
I don't
you
think
go along with that?
Kazakhstan's not on the list.
They're not.
Okay.
It's not gonna
But
happen.
Eleanor, to your point about the alliances, the INF Treaty, America withdrawing, isn't one of the challenges of multilateralism in the present day is that it doesn't seem to have enough weight? Surely if you stay in this treaty, if it's blatantly being breached, you undercut that narrative of liberal internationalism that perhaps defined President Obama.
Well, I respect these alliances, and after watching the funeral services for George H.W. Bush, I came away with more respect than I had at the time for what he managed in, as President Obama put it, landing the plane safely after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And I think you build on these alliances. You don't diss your allies and say you're going to build a new world order with China and Russia, which is what President Trump has said. I don't think he thinks any of this through, and it's not going to happen.
Concluding
What
comment.
you do, look, they have breached the treaty with these cruise missiles they're putting in Kaliningrad. What we ought to do is negotiate with them and tell them what we got and ask them what they demand. I mean, they're concerned because we abrogated the ABM treaty once we had the ability to break out. And we got all what we're doing in Eastern. So why don't you talk to them? That's what Trump is supposed to do.
It's supposed to be
With
the
Novichok,
policy, that's
what
right.
do you think?
The only time that NATO's core function came into being, Article 5, collective self-defense,
9/11.
was
Afghanistan.
after 9/11, the attacks on our
We got to go.
country.
We got to go. When we come back, predictions.
For more than a century, the Greater Washington Board of Trade has focused on growing our regional economy. We work every day to foster collaboration, build pipelines for skilled workers, embrace innovation, and attract investment. We must think, plan, and act as a region to better leverage our shared assets so we can continue shaping and advancing a vibrant regional economy for the next 100 years.
Predictions, Pat.
Under the Paris Climate Accord, the wealthy nations have to give $100 billion a year starting in 2020 to the third world to develop protections against emissions of
Carbon.
Yeah, I hate to break it to you, Tom.
It's
It's
not
not going to happen.
All right.
Paris took care of that.
All right, Eleanor.
I'll break it to you. No money for the wall in the budget before Congress goes home. There won't be a government shutdown either. And unfortunately, there won't be a vote on justice reform, which will be held over to the next Congress, and Nancy Pelosi can negotiate a deal, and maybe that will be the first bipartisan victory that will come out of the next Congress.
John.
Since you mentioned earlier about specific information that Mueller and company have about Trump colluding with the Russians in 2016, it exists, it is real, it is going to start coming out rather soon, some of it a little bit before the end of the year.
Wow. Okay, Clarence.
I predict failure for PETA's campaign to have such phrases as bringing home the bacon changed to less violent sayings such as bring home the bagel.
Okay, all right. So I will quickly say, though, because we've listened to all your feedback, we will do an award show at least once. My prediction will be that Macron will apply the strategy, or the Prime Minister will apply the strategy that was applied in the London riots of recent memory. You arrest everyone, then it stops. Anyway, we hope you'll join us again next week. Very simple but effective. Bye-bye.